Aeronautical engineer Peter Grieve tours air shows giving demonstrations of his Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. He bought it as a wreck 6 years ago and restored it to full working condition. And he can use it to illustrate the Spitfire engine's potentially disastrous tendency to cut out during steep forward dives. The problem occurred because the Spitfire's Merlin engine had a carburetor, whereas the Messerschmitt was fuel injected. With fuel injection, a pilot can do any aerobatics and the engine will keep running smoothly. But a carburetor's performance is affected by changes in G-force, which occur during certain extreme maneuvers.
What happens when you put a Spitfire into a steep dive is a bit like the feeling you get when you go over a humpback bridge in the car. Everything gets thrown upwards. In much the same way, on this Merlin carburettor, the fuel gets thrown upwards in the float chamber, starving the engine of fuel momentarily and making it splutter. The next thing which happens is much more serious. Because the floats which control the fuel flow into the carburettor are being thrown around, it makes the carburettor think that it's empty, and the fuel pump just piles fuel into it, in turn flooding the engine, which will make it cut out.
This kind of steep forward dive is known as a negative G maneuver because it reverses the effects of gravity. Using this wartime engine, Peter can demonstrate that the principle of negative G applies in exactly the same way as it would to the Merlin. When he turns the carburetor upside down, the engine cuts out.
Imagine that happening on your aircraft at 16,000 feet.
Crafty 109 pilots soon learned to exploit this failing of the Spitfire by deliberately forcing their opponents to follow them into a negative G dive.
It was a great advantage for us that we had a fuel injection system and the Spitfire was only equipped with a carburetor. When we had a Spitfire behind us, which we couldn't shake off, we would go into a steep forward dive, and the negative G would starve their carburetor, so we could dive quickly and the Spitfire couldn't keep up.
It was a fault that Spitfire pilots had to live with until well after the Battle of Britain. But the Spitfire wasn't the only one with a handicap. The German Messerschmitt had a crippling problem with fuel too, or more precisely, the lack of it. A major disadvantage that the Messerschmitt faced during the Battle of Britain was its limited flying range. The tank only held enough fuel for about 15 minutes fighting over southern England before the pilot had to head for home, which severely restricted the plane's efficiency as a weapon of war.
We had a lot of problems, and we often had to terminate our attacks because we ran out of fuel. The red warning light would come on, and you'd know you only had 10 or 15 minutes left. Critical if you hadn't started your return flight by then. You'd hear anxious cries over the radio from fellow pilots when they saw the warning light come on. From time to time, people had to make crash landings. It was a big problem for us, a big handicap.